Welcome to Alexandrians with Dani and Karim, where I interview authors, both living and dead ones, the power of AI. Today's guest is Norman Bacal, a best-selling author, lawyer, and entrepreneur who has built one of Canada's most prestigious law firms in history. We talk about the art of leading a decisive life, lawfare, and the wisdom of knowing when to fight and when not to fight, and the lessons he learned from advising Canada's Prime Minister and other world leaders. We explore also how to negotiate and listen like a lawyer, and what it means to truly reinvent yourself when the world you built disappears overnight. Enjoy this conversation, and if it speaks to your heart, don't forget to share it with other Alexandrian spirits so that they can learn also. Enjoy. Norman, welcome to the show. Thank you for making room for this.
Very happy to be with you today, Daniel.
Um, for me, conversations are a little bit like an adventure where you go back and forth and exchange stories. And one of the things that I often ask in the beginning when I go on adventures with friends is where it all started. And a name is something that in my culture means a lot. What's the meaning and story behind your name, so to say?
Behind my name, you'd have to go back to my great grandfather, and for which I have a great story to tell about him because he is my namesake. He emigrated from Romania to Canada at the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s, and joined a very small community in Quebec City. And the joke was he thought he was getting off in New York, but ended up in Canada instead. Um, but there was so they lived in a very small uh, and cloistered Jewish community in Quebec City, which was largely French, and they were, uh, I think, because of the Romanian, they spoke French as well as probably two or three other languages. But so while I was named after him, I really didn't know very much about him other than he was an itinerant vendor up and down the coast selling goods to French Canadians and to the native people, and leaving my great grandmother to raise the seven children. At that time, they were just seven. She actually died in childbirth with the eighth. But before that happened, uh, a woman got off the boat, also from Romania, an illegal immigrant trying to escape. This was later on, trying to escape in the period between the two wars. And she arrived in Quebec City, and because she didn't have the proper papers, uh, they incarcerated her over the weekend in with a plan to put her back on the boat back to the old country where she certainly would have been incinerated eventually. Um, and what happened was it was my great grandmother who gathered the community in her living room. It was a regular gathering place, along with all the kids who were just young teenagers at the time. And she actually there was no room in the jailhouse, so they had put this woman into at the schoolhouse and locked her up there for the weekend. And on Saturday night, and it was middle of the winter, so they got the sleds together and went secretly to the school. And somebody brought a ladder. They knocked out the window. This woman climbed out the ladder. They threw her on the sled, which was pulled by a bunch of horses, and she disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. So when I thought about it, and I ended up writing a short story about this, and actually it's one of the speeches I tend to give. But when I think about the risks that she took, clearly she was breaking the law. It was a crime. She could have gone to jail. She kind of led the insurrection. And I like to think that somewhere in the world right now, maybe somewhere even in Western Canada, there's somebody about my age talking about, but for the kindness of strangers who their ancestor never even met,
Mm.
uh, they wouldn't be here today. So it's my great grandmother who's the family hero.
Very, very inspiring. It's, I briefed you also what I'm working on. if you would have her here, what would be a question you would ask her, so to say?
Really what I would like to know is, because I got my grandfather actually never told that story until until I went to visit him in his 93rd year, and it was literally just a few months before he died, and all these old stories became much more clear to him. But really, what I'd like to know it was, uh, what was it like coming over? What is it? How much courage is involved in leaving someplace, even if it's someplace you're not really comfortable living in anymore, and going to a complete unknown with nothing? And that's what all these immigrants did. And which is why it's very hard for me to look at any immigrants coming to our country and say they don't belong here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We've all been immigrants if we look back far enough to say. I think like this is also like a you you also have a background in rules, in law,
Yes.
in justice, but at the same time, it seems like your story also started with breaking the rules. Um, what was your relationship with justice growing up? It seems that this is a topic that has been dear to your heart, if I may say so.
It's interesting because I made a living as a tax lawyer for many years, helping to build the Canadian film and television industry, but on the back of our Canadian tax system. Uh, some would say that the managing partner of our firm, while I was building this, uh, suggested what I was doing might, while it was completely legal, he thought perhaps it was immoral to have rich Canadians saving taxes to invest in the industry. And the way I preferred to look at it was a means to an end. The government set up a system so that Canada could build an industry, and my job, and I was very passionate about it for many years, was to get as many uh, films and television shows that otherwise would have been made either in Los Angeles or elsewhere in the world, have them made in Canada, so we could build the infrastructure, which today, 35 years later, everyone takes for granted.
Yeah, interesting. And I think like I have a background in counseling and I wrote a lot of books about therapy. One of the things I love about the therapeutic profession is that in therapy, it is really like a successful craftsman is one who gets forgotten. It's like the mentors that I had were some of the best in the world. And sometimes I bragged about them. It's like my client just came to me and they thanked me for the great successes that they have achieved. And I said, this, Daniel, is how you recognize you have been doing a bad job because you have robbed the client of claiming the victory for themselves. And
Oh,
I like the idea that our great ancestors are the successful ones and the ones who are not being remembered in some sense because they made it about other people and where many of the great inventions we now take for granted.
but
And
it
it's like, yeah,
but it is a great reminder, and that is of two things. One, there's no way we can really assess uh, the impact of our stay here, however temporary, whether it's shorter or it's relatively long. And that will be judged by people who we will never meet.
yeah,
And so that, but from an instruction in terms of how to lead your life, to my mind, it's about, all right, be conscious of the fact that I may say or do something that 25 years from now, someone will look at and say, but for that, I wouldn't be here today. And that's very powerful as long as you don't need to hear it from that person. So if you can put your ego aside and just understand this is the way the world works, if you allow it to, and if you do your best to pay forward whatever kindness is or advice people gave you over the years that they have no idea they imparted on you.
in where I'm from, advice is often seen as an answer, but for me, the great people I've met always entrusted me with a question, which was much a headache to me sometimes because I wanted them to give me the keys, give me the secret sauce. What do you feel was in the earliest chapter of your life, a question that you feel you devoted a chunk of your life to that was interesting to you?
I think I'd say it's interesting. If I go back far enough, I would say I could never have imagined anything I did in my life. When I was a child, I thought, my mother was trying to wash me into becoming a doctor. She'd say, "Oh, you'd make such a good doctor, just like your uncle, her brother." And but I had to find my way. I had to find that that was not my future, and how I found out is its own little story. But but in terms of what my life was, I couldn't have imagined it. And it's one of the reasons that spurred me to do the TED Talk that I did a number of years ago. I was asked to lecture at a university in Toronto, and the subject matter of the entire weekend was blueprints, and which I thought was kind of interesting. And I just applied. I applied on a lark. Nobody asked me. I caught it in my feed. I had been rejected to do a number of TED Talks. This was going to be covered by TED, and so I decided, just for fun, I'm going to lob in my thesis, which is there's no such thing as blueprints. Anybody who believes they can chart out their life is pretty much lying to themselves, with a few small exceptions. But those exceptions, I think, prove the rule. And that is that most of the things we're going to do in our life, major and minor, we can't predict. All we can do is set ourselves up for success. And how do we do that? And that ended up being this, I almost laughed because when I got the response from them, it was a very long 4 paragraph email with very flowery language, which is usually how my rejection letters look when I get them. So I almost didn't read it, but at the end, in the fourth paragraph, it said, "Oh, and we are thrilled to have you as the final speaker of the weekend." So then I had to get to work, but in the course of fleshing out that thesis and applying it to my own life, it allowed me to see everything I have done and everything I will do in a whole different light, and everything that anybody watching this could benefit from, in terms of, what are the things you have to do. As I ultimately I titled the talk as "How do you become the person you can't imagine," as opposed to the person you want to be. And it all started with my, going back to my great grandmother. Her oldest son, which was my grandfather's brother, his name was Harry, and Harry became a doctor. And I went to visit him. He was on my father's side, and he was a very famous pediatrician in Montreal. Again, when I went to see him, I still didn't know half of his story. I found out long after his death. But as it turned out, he was on his deathbed when I went to visit him. I was 18 years old. And he gave me 2 pieces of advice that, again, I didn't take at the time, but when I reflected back, I saw that I followed. And he said, whatever you do, whatever you choose to do, whatever your major occupation or preoccupation is, make sure you love it or come to love it. That's one. He said, and two, he said, try not to chase after, that the shiny object on the other shore. Imagine that you're launching your boat into a river, and you can either paddle against the current to reach the shiny object and arrive there exhausted, or you can point your boat down the river and navigate it and pick off the opportunities as they come by. He said that worked for me. I suggest you think about that. And then I promptly did, I think, what most 19-year-olds did at the time, which is I went to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show 15 times and never thought about it. But later on, I saw, when I went back and studied what I had done, it's exactly what I did. So maybe it buried itself subliminally, and maybe anybody listening to this will have an aha moment. We can only hope.
You how to become the person you can't imagine to be. This reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite authors, is Viktor Frankl, who said, "Idealists are the real realists." And that he had this beautiful metaphor when he was counseling people, where he challenged them to put themselves into the shoes of their future self, like their ideal future self. And he made this plain metaphor, I think, where you said like pilots, they can't aim at the place they want to arrive due to currents, and they have to aim further to arrive at the plane of the destination. And he challenged us to have a similar kind of philosophy for our own life, to like aim more bolder than what we feel comfortable in doing. So one of the questions that I have is like, what would be a mentoring force in your earliest chapter? It can be an author, it can be a parent, can be a friend, can be a site you discovered that motivated you to aim higher than the ordinary person, because you've had a very eventful, extraordinary life.
Yeah, it's funny. I never thought of it as aiming higher. And as an aside, I'll just back up and say Viktor Frankl is one of my heroes. Um, just for what he went through in terms of life experience and what he was able to give the entire world as a result. Um, but I think I'd say, and I'm not sure there's a single answer to this, other than in terms of what has always driven me. Um, I try not to ever say no to a new opportunity. I prefer to try it. And what I learned, sometimes the easy way and sometimes the hard way, was the best way to move forward in my career was to fail, get up, try again until I got it right. And I every time I applied it worked for me, including a few of the things I would have assured anyone. And this is why when we talk about becoming the person you can't imagine, if you had asked me even at age 36, I would have told you I am never going uh, to lead an organization of lawyers. That is it's a complete non-starter. I'm never doing that. If you'd asked me when I was 39, I would have said it again. But at 40, when I was approached because my predecessor discovered suddenly he had cancer and needed to resign, and I was tapped on the shoulder and said, "Would you do it?" Um, I said yes. This was after long discussion with my wife. Should I do it? I have no idea if I could succeed at this. But I went at the end, I reverted back to what I'd always done. I never knew whether I could.
Tell us
And
about, it's quite extraordinary.
no,
One moment, you're gone there for a second. So about when did you fall in love with law? Or was this a romance? Or was this more fate conspiring on your behalf to get into this niche? Because one of the things that I'm interested in is actually not that many people blessed with an entire career. It's no, really, it's a privilege that you find a niche and you were able to
but
get into the job.
yeah, that's not a fair interpretation, though. I think I was able to stay in the same place, but I probably had three or four different careers while I was there.
Interesting. Okay.
The first 5 years, I was a lawyer going nowhere with with all the talent in the world, but no direction. But if I go back further, I guess it started in high school when I was studying Talmudic law and actually enjoyed it. And it was a thing that made it maybe out of a class of 100, there were only about 8 of us who showed any interest in arguing law, which is what it was, and learning about it. And then the rest was a bit magic and happenstance. Um, I was literally, I was, I did my first year in McGill in science. I was in biology. That's what I went in for as my major, thinking I needed to determine whether I wanted to be a doctor. And I was literally 2 weeks into the semester, and I walk into the biology lab, and which is something that I had done for years in high school and college before university. never had a problem, but I'm looking down a microscope in this huge McGill University sized lab with lots of stations, and I'm trying to find a fungus on a slide. And I'm moving the slide around, and I've done this hundreds of times in the last few years, but this particular day, I could not get the slide under the microscope properly. I could not find what I was supposed to be looking for, and I was supposed to be drawing it. And I could feel the sweat begin to pour down me because there were like 10, 12 people standing in line impatiently behind me because we all had to do it. You know, you sit down, you do it, you draw it, you move on to the next station. And after about 3 or 4, I don't even know how much time. All I know is it felt like a complete eternity. I finally find that fungus and I begin to draw it. And in the middle, like about one third of the way through, I said, what am I doing here? I don't want to be a doctor. And literally, I closed my notebook. I picked up my knapsack. It was an ugly green, forest green knapsack. I still remember. Put it on my shoulder. Walked out of the lab without saying goodbye to anyone. Walked down to my course advisor's office, and I said, "How do I get out of this?" And she asked the question that would then drive the rest of my life. She said, "Well, we have to replace the biology lab course with something. What what courses in high school did you enjoy?" And I remembered this particular course. And I said, well, I guess something in law. We found a course. There was only one law course being given in the winter semester, and I now needed to take it in order to finish my first year. And I took it. It was a course called Legal Problems of the Poor. And it was taught by a fellow by the name of Robert Cooper. And he and I clicked. So it wasn't just the course material, but I found him enchanting. He also happened to have been a face that I saw on television every night as a teenager. Quebec had a commission into organized crime, and he was one of the prosecutors.
Mm.
Uh, he went on, so he was a lawyer teaching this, and he ended up, we clicked on a personal basis. He wrote me the letter of recommendation that helped me get into law school. And I had to get into law school because I had to get I had to get out of science. And the rest is what I call proverbially history. But, and here's the biggest but and the best part, is he went on to become a film and television producer in Los Angeles, and about 10 years later became one of my prominent clients.
If you would be in the room now with this version of you, this younger self who was set to, that version really set the direction for your life in some way. And I find it fascinating. And sometimes we are completely blind to the fact that we're in a pivotal moment of our life in a way. And you could arm that younger self of you with something, a piece of wisdom, advice, tools, like, or somebody who just made that decision on how to set the path for their life. What would you give them?
I would tell them, actually, I would give them the same piece of advice I got from someone else a few years later. I was sitting at a dinner, one of these rubber chicken dinners that you go to when you're a young lawyer, even though you don't want to be there. And I was sitting next to another legal professional. This was Montreal, and he was telling me about his past. He was a very successful professional. He was a Quebec notary and basically the equivalent of a real estate lawyer. And he said, the one thing I noticed was all my friends, all my cohort, uh, were always looking for the next big thing for their career. So they checkerboarded around a lot. They were always looking, what's better than what I'm doing right now. He said, whereas I decided, I'm at a good firm. I think I can be happy here. I'm just going to stick it out. And at every moment, every inflection moment where he had the should I stay or should I leave, he said, I'm staying. And he ended up having an extraordinarily successful and lucrative career behind his desk. He got to do all kinds of things that he never could have imagined when he was that young professional. And what he didn't realize was he planted a thought in the back of my mind, and that at every inflection point where I thought about leaving or trying something else, or maybe I was in a period of, a brief period of unhappiness, and those things will happen over the course of a career, or lack of fulfillment. I just said to myself, I'm taking Harvey's advice. I'm going to
Mm.
stick with it and see where it takes me. And when I wrote my manual for young professionals and students, it's called Take Charge. I put in just a chapter on that advice and what it meant for me. And it wouldn't necessarily work for everyone, but it was sort of, if I look back at my life, one of the most important pieces of advice I got as a guiding post was that. So at 90 years old, I called him up. He still lives in Montreal. He was Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney is the former Prime Minister of Canada. He was his next door neighbor and good friend. And I said, listen, I just want you to know I've written a book. I'm going to mail it to you, and you're in it. And he said, why? And I told him about this. He said, Norm, he said, I don't recall that night. I don't recall the conversation. I'm sure it's something I might have said, but I don't recall ever saying it to you.
Wow. Um, how to lead a decisive life. I love the thought behind it. And for me, one of the things that I wish that somebody said for me is that these moments where you're about to give up are selection agents, or they're like crossroads where many of my co-founders in the past, for instance, when things got really tough, they quit. And at the moment, I thought they were right, because immediately I saw them make more money than me and get the fame, and or the way they almost like jumped the hardship a little bit. And then but for me in my mind, I never had like external good offers. So I couldn't pick something.
Makes it easier.
I tried getting a job, I couldn't get it. So I was just stuck with my ventures of like with what I was really interested in. And it was very fascinating to me that I talked to David Vertiger. He's a best-selling author, and he consults very successful families on family offices. And he said
Mhm.
there's a point where usually companies survive if they survive until a certain stage. There's this idea of you're just getting good enough, you have enough, everything compounds around you. And I just didn't know this. And now I'm at a stage where I'm meeting friends left and right. And maybe for the person listening to this also, it's if you stick with one thing, it's 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 gonna add up in a way. And I feel like changing partners, changing ventures, changing careers, so many often will rob you of the groundwork that it needs to live a decisive life. What is the bad advice you've gotten in the earliest chapters of your life? I feel like there's also plenty of that in a way.
Uh, the only I wouldn't call it bad advice. I'd point to the doubters. Are you sure you want to try this?
Mhm.
You really think you're going to be successful at that? Those are the people you need to you need to boot them out of your life. It's hard enough as it is, but to have people who are your friends uh, raining their doubts on you is not a good way to live. So, um, and I still remember I was 30. I guess I was 33 years old. No, 32 still when I made the decision I was going to leave Montreal, which was I had a you know, we I was a partner in my firm. My wife was a partner in her accounting firm. We just built a house in the suburbs. She was pregnant with her fourth child, and we were sitting. It was New Year's Eve, 1989, and or turning into 1989. And I said, "That's it. I have to leave Montreal. We have to go to Toronto. I'm going to hang up a shingle in Toronto, and if the firm wants to start an office, I'm ready to do it." And it was just the that inner part of me that just said, "Okay, it's time. I've got to do something else now." And it was funny. I was working in an office of about 50 lawyers, and I felt there are just too many lawyers here. And I say that with irony because the firm I built ended up with 600 lawyers and 10 cities and offices in Paris and Beverly Hills, and I was at one point co-running the whole show, but at that point in time, 50 lawyers was just too big for me, and But and when we were 200 lawyers in Toronto, I actually still felt like it was a, for me, it still felt like a small firm because I knew everybody. And we can, we can get to that later in terms of management philosophies and things like that. But, but I still remember it was one of those, it was a crazy idea uh, where, any number of people came up to me and said, "Are you sure you want to try this? Like you could fall flat on your face and then what are you going to do?" And it never occurred to me to worry about it.
Now, one of the things I find interesting is one of the old words for the devil is doubter, which I find so interesting that we've forgotten this. For me,
Mhm.
like through my father, I rediscovered these old stories, and that meant a lot to me. And it's very interesting for me. I'm looking to them more for psychological lens in a way, but I'm very interested in the opposition of belief, and it seems to be doubt because it's also a story that's been trying to put
Mhm.
over you in a way. What was your relationship with belief growing up? Like, who do you think was one of the people who equipped you with your myth, and what do you think was your story? What way the
Sorry, who equipped me
programming
with my, sorry, equipped me with my,
myth, the story, like a myth, the mythology that was running you? Who installed the programming? And
oh,
then if you would
I
look back
wouldn't,
at it, like, what do you think was the story, like the movie of your life that you were writing at a particular time?
all right.
That's
Yeah.
a
And I
very
wouldn't, yeah,
so a very
it's pretty,
abstract
I
question.
don't, I don't think there was, I think we create the mythologies afterwards
Mm.
and not before. Like we live it, then we look back, then we recreate the story. But I'll say that, but I had one exception to that. And it was something that I learned, and it was just the luck, the firm that I worked for in Montreal, um, uh, had a different way of looking at the entire world. And um, it was very much a firm that believed in people, put money second, relationships first. They were the leaders of the firm were some of the most brilliant minds in the country, and but they never took themselves too seriously. And that's what I was brought up with. That's what I inherited. And I said, remember the day I said I have to go to Toronto. That was the experiment I began, where I said, okay, that's what I loved about this place. It was a counterculture. It was a place that wouldn't even hire me. I didn't get hired through the interview process. I got hired because somebody I knew who worked there walked into and this is the kind of firm it was, that a first year lawyer could walk into the office of the managing partner and say, you have to hire this guy. And they'd listen to him. And it was somebody they hadn't hired me through the interview process, but it was now 2 years later, and I was actually planning to move to Toronto at that time, but changed my mind. We decided to stay, and I was only going to stay if I could get a job at this firm. It was the only place in Montreal I would work for. Don't ask me why. It wasn't rational. But what they were very good at was creating the mythology that this was the only place. If you were going to be a lawyer, this is the only place where you could be happy if you had this kind of personality, which is a bit bright, counterculture, and in it to have fun, and to hopefully change the world above money. Money was at the bottom of the priorities. And what that did was build a loyalty in me that I could never uh, understand. It created an emotional bond so that every time, and this goes back to Harvey's advice, every time I thought about leaving, I just said to myself, I couldn't do it to them. I couldn't leave them. But I was conscious of it, and conscious enough that when I started the experiment in Toronto, I said, that's what I want to build, a place where people won't even take the phone calls from the headhunters, where I want them every time the phone's ring to say, I could never leave Norm or my other partners. I couldn't do that too. So how do you build that? And that, of course, it's all mythology. And I didn't understand that much at the time. And it was only when I started reading Yuval Harari, that I could put it into exact perspective. Okay, we're like the cavemen with the tribes, and here's our tribal story. We are a tribe. That is our cult. And he calls it a cult delusion. And I completely understand it. You just delude yourself. And so, for example, one of the things that I deluded everyone into believing as we grew it was you'll come join us if money isn't your prime objective. And in fact, I will guarantee you, you will earn less than at one of the major firms. But what you're trading that for is the greatest experience of your life and an excitement to wake up in the morning that you'll never feel anywhere else. Was that true? Doesn't really matter. Did everybody believe it, including me? Absolutely.
Also interesting what this says about the human condition, who we are. Maybe
We need
maybe
to belong. We need to belong.
we need to belong. And okay, you mentioned the word management philosophy. I'm starting a venture right now where I hope to be the place for people who honor the ancestors who came before us and to collaborate on rebuilding the Alexandrian library that I told you about. This is I'm very passionate
Mhm.
about. Do you have some advice for me on the for the founders, or doesn't necessarily have to be me? The founder can also be somebody who, at my side, for instance, tries to utilize these forces towards a common vision. How did you guys pull this off from somebody who's, for me, founders are like adventurous in a way. They go on and usually it doesn't work, and only crazy people join. But some came back and lived to tell the tale. What is some, if you would pass like a little manuscript for
Yeah, I
how to lead or something? How what would that be?
yeah, I'd say one, you need to start with what your founding strategy is, and your strategy will change over time, particularly as you grow. You'll begin to see things you can't see today. You will begin to understand things you can't understand today, and you will be able to chart a future you can't even begin to see today. So, what 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 you're looking at today in terms of what you want to start with, if you're fortunate, isn't going to be anything like what you're going to be thinking about in 5 years. And being open to that, to my mind, is fundamental. So, could Steve Jobs have foreseen what Apple has become when he was trying to create that first Mac? Of course not. Even when he said we are going to we are going to turn that cell phone into a computer. It was a dream. But could he have imagined? He could probably vaguely imagine the Apple 17 and beyond, and artificial intelligence. But all he could do was start it on the road and create a philosophy, an approach, and a culture that allowed for that to happen. So to circle back, I'd say the first thing you need is your starting strategy, and I think you have it. But equally important, as far as I'm concerned, is understanding what your cultural objective is. Like, what's your cult? I go so far as to say, what is the cult you are creating? What are the principles of that cult? Um, and then making sure that anybody who joins you on this quest shares it. And if they don't take them. It doesn't matter how smart they are. Don't take them along. They will destroy you. You've got to. And when I was going out and hiring, I would go. I would go see people. And once we began to be successful, it was sort of a, here's your choice. And I would say, if you want more money, go to that firm. And there was a list of two or three. I would say, go there. So if that's what's driving you, which is fine. And a number of the people who I interviewed did just that. And they would have been extraordinarily unhappy, regardless of how successful they were with me, because they wouldn't have fit. So ideally, you want people who buy into the mythology you're creating, who fit, and we are going to conquer the world in our way together. There's nothing more powerful, and they have to believe it.
The word that I'm hearing in my is conviction, and it's one of the most unexplainable human traits for me that some people somehow possess is inevitability. I feel like some people you see and you can't really put it into words, but some people have it where
Mm.
they are going they will not be stopped in a way. If you would write a little chapter on conviction or charisma or that fanatical belief that the founder has, because like true founders for me are more than business people. They're almost like prophets where they see a future, they know something other people can't sing, and they are dancing to a tune that cannot be adhered to the people around, and they somewhat communicate that to others. How do you create such a person, or do these people just accidentally come across, so to say?
You can't. There's some things, and I do a lot of mentoring and teaching, and I've hired a lot of people, like thousands over the years. There's some things you can't teach. It's the inner fire that maybe you'll see in one in 100 people or one in 1,000 people, and you know it. Oh, I would say for everybody I hired, I knew within 6 weeks whether they had it. And some people were, the journey people, the people who were, in with you for a few years, and I know it after 6 weeks. I just know, okay, this person is coming on the journey for a bit. They're going to be a bit player in the overall story. We need them right now. They are not the future. And then there were other people, some of whom I hired as students, one of whom I hired before he even got into law school. And after 30 minutes with that person, I said that fellow's going to be my partner one day. And that person is now, the firm is gone, but that person is now one of the leading lawyers in the country in his area of expertise. But it's the kind of thing I could see it on day one. And and it's interesting because I think somebody who looked at me on day one would have said, yes, all the potential in the world, but in year four, still wasn't realizing it. As one, as my boss and my mentor said, there's something missing. I can't explain it. I can't explain to you what it was. And all it was, and it took my wife to point it out to me, was that I wasn't showing initiative. I wasn't taking charge. That's why I wrote the book, Take Charge, because I want people to understand that's something you can't be taught. It's something you have to find in yourself. So that fire and that drive and that person who went from at the end of fourth year, I was completely obscure to 18 months later, I became one of the big names in the Canadian film and television industry, like that in 18 months. And then the success fed itself. And suddenly I was able to see connections I couldn't see before. I changed my behavior. You took an introverted, shy, retiring, uh, brain. That's what I was, or geek. When you're doing tax law, people more or less see you as a geek, and suddenly began to understand I had to put a shine on this. I had to change the way I behaved. And as soon as I understood that, I started acting differently until the act became me.
Mhm.
But I didn't start there. I mean, some people probably do start there, and I know I had the privilege to spend 10 minutes walking with somebody the other day. He was a keynote speaker, one of Toronto's leading business people who also started as a lawyer. Um, and he told me his background from pretty much from age 15, he was an entrepreneur who then went to law school and then became one of Canada's leading entrepreneurs. But he was born with something that I will never have. And it doesn't matter how hard I try.
What was said when he was born?
He was born with business sense.
Mhm.
I was in grade 10 hiring my teachers to work for me because they needed extra money. That's what I'm saying. Those come along, those are the one in the million. But for the rest of us, there are skills we can learn, but you have to be able to push yourself and you have to understand what motivates me and then what's going to motivate everybody around me. But but and not a lot of people have it. They don't have the fire burning and they never will. But those who can light it And for me, it was just a question of igniting it. And then I became a different person. Like I'm not who I was, when I was a fourth year lawyer.
I did some, I wrote a lot of books about behavior psychology, and they were mostly behavior therapy workbooks for people. And one of the exercises was where people would reinvestigate their past for where they would drive success momentum and identify the particular behaviors that they were manifesting and revisit if these behaviors still are being exercised in that particular day. And one of the things that surprised me was that when people just sometimes forget certain things that have brought them to successful outcomes, and that it's very possible to change them. If you would describe the behavior of Norman when things started to click for you, what do you feel were the 20% of behaviors that gave you 80% of those results that followed?
Uh, I still reduce it to one word, and that's taking charge, taking initiative.
Yeah.
It was a change of mindset. I was no longer going to let my life happen to me, my career happen to me, and that if I took active steps every single day to control the outcome of what the day was going to be, it was going to be a much better day. So if I wanted to, if I needed somebody to get in touch with me, who I thought could help my career, I didn't sit back anymore and wait for the phone to ring. I started thinking, okay, who are the three people that could possibly introduce me to that person and put in a good word for me so that I can get in front of them?
Mm.
Or how do I volunteer to do something that will put me squarely in front of that person? So again, instead of waiting for things to happen, suddenly I was bubbling. And the one thing you discover when you start to change in that way and good things start to happen, they don't have to be huge things, they just have to be little things, is you get the reinforcement in your brain. It's beginning to work. All right, so what else can do? And it kind of feeds on itself as as your neural loops are changing. You're making new connections in your brain. The dopamine feels great, and that just eggs you on to keep doing it and to try something new. To the point where, and I'm fond of saying is it's like you can't ever stop. Like even when you get to my age now at almost 70, you can't ever stop. It's you're a shark. You need to keep swimming, or you're going to fall back and die. You can't breathe, and that means continually trying things I don't know how to do. So I had a client that same client who I talked about, my law teacher. If you want to come full circle, he came to me years later and he said, listen, a major broadcaster wants to invest $50 million Canadian in a new company that I'm going to set up. Can you do it? And my inner voice said, of course not. I've never done anything like that. I don't know how to negotiate a deal. And my outer voice said, sure, because I've been negotiating other deals for years. And how hard is this going to be to learn? I'll figure it out. But that's why that was, that took 20 years to get to the point where I could confidently project that I can do this, even though I'd never done it. Okay, and I might, because I could feel the brain working immediately. Okay, I just need to surround myself with people who know how to draft these contracts. I've negotiated lots of deals before. How hard can it be to figure out what the major deal points are and negotiate them with the head of a television network? And the answer was, Norm, you're out of your mind if you think you could do this. But the reality was, I could do it. I did. But and I want to take it back a little bit because um, this kind of confidence um, doesn't come on its own. You're not born with it. And I can tell you there were a number of stops along the road while I was building this thing, uh, where people would come into my office and say, Norm, it looks like you're failing. And you had this dream of what you wanted to build, and it's just not happening. And they were right. At 6 years and at 9 years, that there was a little voice in my head saying maybe you can't do what you think you can do. And and I go to bed and I come back in the morning and I'd say, I'm doing it anyway. And to the point where I'd have not fist fights, but I would have verbal fights with these people and saying, listen, I don't care what you think. I'm doing it. And if you don't like it, leave. But we're doing it. I'm not giving up. And then and I had to live with that for 2 or 3 years till, till we reached the next level, till things began to click. And once it clicked at that next level, we shot. We shot. And suddenly the the myth that I'd been selling at that point in time for 20 years was real. Like, we did it. We got to that level. People know the name of my firm. We're among the most respected firms in the country. And nobody can figure out how we did it. And it's because, the vision finally materialized. Uh, but over and the one thing I learned from it is, like, I needed that period in the wilderness. Like, it worked for Moses, it worked for Jesus. I don't want to compare myself to either of them, because I'm not even sure they existed. But um, but I'm saying you need that kind of feeling that your mission will succeed, regardless of, what the personal tortures are that you're going through. Because the only way people will follow you is if you keep leading them and you keep believing them. And then, and when you hit that moment where things begin to click, then uh, then you're off and running. And sorry, I didn't mean to be disrespectful. It just came out of my mouth without thinking. Uh,
This is beautiful. I'm really, this was one of my favorite moments of the podcast. You're the first person who ever thought, put the wilderness as a concept out there, because I feel people are not talking enough about it. Adventures that are new of any sorts are, like, my father gave me this cup. My father converted to Judaism in a way, and he's often told me the stories where, for instance, Moses was leading people out of slavery, and that the first thing is not the promised land then comes. It's the wilderness and the desert where famine and problems are waiting. And one of the things that he always mentions, that in that story, it's generations that had to wait until that particular certain outcome is waiting. So it's like one of the things that I admire is the things that you're learning to have while you're without. And I think, like, the wilderness as a concept teaches you many things. What do you feel was your time in obscurity? What was obscurity teaching you, or that wilderness chapter, so to say?
it was teaching me patience more than anything else. You can't always get what you want when you want it. And sometimes what you just have to do is keep at it until suddenly you see the way. And when the way appears to you, it becomes so obvious. And some of it is just, part of it is just good luck. But it's you make decisions, you decide to do things. Um, you acknowledge that as a leader, one out of every four decisions you're going to make is going to be wrong. But you have to keep making the decisions. You have to keep trying things, and then you go with the ones that work, and you grow them. It's and you have to keep stressing. One of the things I learned much later on, because I could never grow a plant, but I started tending to orchids, and only after I'd given up because I'd killed so many, and I didn't realize that when the orchid dies off and the shoot completely dies, it will, if you're patient and keep, in my view, give it a south view and feed it 3 ice cubes a week, and that's it. And the idea is you need to stress the plant. Doesn't work on all plants, but it does on orchids. And if by stressing the plant, by giving it not quite enough water, it will deal with the stress by growing a new shoot and blossoming. And ultimately, I think the same is true for all of us. If we choose the easy path, the one with the least possible amount of stress, we don't grow.
a quote that comes from mind from Friedrich Nietzsche: "What does not kill you makes you stronger." And I've been thinking a lot about this recently because it's been Alexandrian as a venture for me has been incredibly difficult, and I've failed on multiple times. It took me 3 years to arrive at this point, but retrospectively, I feel it was necessary for me to grow the kind of character who I am right now to do this. And it's very strange because when you're in it in the wilderness and everything falls apart, it doesn't feel like this is happening for you in a way. And as somebody who came out of that and who won, if you would write a very tiny secret ebook called Norman Bacal's Rules for Winning, what would be the three rules you would add to that?
Ah, before I can give you that, I have to punctuate the story because I sound like this person who, like the exponential curve, you start small and then suddenly everything takes off and you rise forever.
Please do
But
so.
like any good bacteria, when you've risen to a point, you start destroying yourself. And and for your audience, I think it's important to know that 1 year after I left my leadership position, my firm collapsed. So everything I built for 25 years was suddenly gone like that. And it certainly it makes you doubt yourself. It creates a sense of huge loss and mourning and anger, and you need to figure out who you're going to blame for all this. And not only that, but when you go through that kind of major loss, so Canada's the press reported it as the greatest failure in Canadian law firm history.
Oh, wow.
And I had become the face of it because I stepped back in at the end in an effort to save it, failed. And those are two important words from my TED Talk. I failed. All right. I'm in my mid 50s and I have failed after years and years and years of success. And when I'm walking down the street and people see me because I'm well enough known, it's I feel like I can't get away uh, uh, from my funeral clothes. Like everybody's looking at me like I'm in mourning and I'm in loss and I can't escape it anywhere. All I'm getting are mournful eyes from everybody feeling sorry for me, and that only makes you feel worse. So, so I went from there and suddenly I'm all the way back at the bottom again. And like, where do I go? How do I restart? Everything I've built is gone. Um, and and as I used to say to the people who came to me, put their arms around me and said, "This too shall pass, and it will make you stronger." My inner voice was saying, "I'll tell you what, let's trade places. You get stronger." I don't particularly like this. After success and success, this isn't supposed to happen to me, but it did. And this I can only say now, 11 years later, this was my rebirth. I would never have been an author. As I said before, the person I couldn't imagine was never going to run a law firm. And the other thing he was never going to do was write a book. And at one point in time, the other thing he was never going to do was be on a podcast or give a speech or talk to a major audience. And I didn't think I had any of that in me. But here I was. I no longer had a law firm. I no longer had a client. I was, in some respects, thinking, do I retire and disappear and figure out the rest of my life later, or do I restart? And if I'm restarting, how, why, and what? And it took me a few years to figure it out, but I was figuring it out from all the way back to point zero. And which for me now, when I talk about it, and when I walk into whether it's a classroom to lecture at a university or a firm or anywhere else, I can look at them and say, listen, I am not, the old person talking about how I did it in the old days, and none of this applies. Like, there's no lesson for you to learn in this because I did it in a different economy, in a different world, and in a highly less technological society. And now the whole world has changed. So what do I have of value to offer you? And my answer is, wait a minute. 11 years ago, I was exactly where you are. I was back to nobody. I was back to no skills. I was back to having to start over and proving whether my methodology the first time around was if you let the fire burn and find whatever it is that's going to excite you, now it needs to be something else. And it turned out it was writing, at first nonfiction, and then I tried my hand at fiction. And again, when I started writing fiction, when I gave my manuscript to my nonfiction editor and said, "Listen, am I on the right track?" And she said, "Norm, it's a very credible story for an amateur. Congratulations." And that was the knife going between my ribs. And then the second thing she said was, and we had a good enough relationship that she could say it. She said, Norm, there are about 10 skills that every great fiction author has, and you have none of them." So she recommended fiction for dummies, and that's where I started. And then I started, reaching out uh, to people who teach writing and screenwriting and who've written books about it and read their secrets. Then I picked out my favorite authors and started studying what they were doing, how they were doing it. So I was learning a whole new skill from scratch. And this is what I tell the students that I lecture. I'm doing it now. And I can tell you, you follow this formula, this is how you're going to be successful, not 25 years ago, but today. Okay, I've got 5 books. I'm working on number 6 and number 7. I'm lecturing, around the country, and I do, podcasts wherever I can, and I do mentor as many young people, which is my way of giving back. Because at the end of the day, the city of Toronto was very good to me, gave me a life and a family that I never could have imagined. My job is to pay it forward. So, but none of this would have been relevant. My story, as far as I'm concerned, would have been almost completely irrelevant if I'd ridden off into the sunset as a very successful firm builder, or retired into my office as the chairman emeritus. Like, that would have been, in hindsight, that would have been a waste of the rest of my life. But I couldn't know that without the failure.
Very
Again, this
interesting. Very interesting how
back
we.
in wilderness.
No, no. I think thanks so much for sharing this. This is, I think, very, very. We talked earlier about inflection points, right? And I feel like when I mentioned that these are selection crossroads where not only it's determined who you are going to become, and I think there is something very, very interesting in highlighting that when a chapter ends, that based on your decision, the quality of your book is being determined that you're writing through your actions. What advice would you give somebody where their life has just collapsed? And that collapsing can mean many things. It can be success. It can be a partner has left them. It can be their venture collided, or it got acquired, which it pretty much causes similar to.
Yeah.
What would you give to somebody who is beginning to write a new book with their life, so to say?
Yeah, and I'd say the hardest part is figuring out what to do next. But the one thing I saw, and I had my eyes open to it in hindsight, was uh, if things had gone smoothly, I might still be wondering what to do with the rest of my life. And it was only in facing the calamity, whatever it is, and beginning to recognize that only I could pull myself out of it and in the funk. Uh, there are people who swear by, I'm trying to remember what they're called, sort of your daily journaling. And I find that for that 6 month period of my mourning with a U, um, again, it was my wife's suggestion. She handed me the blank notebook and said, "You need to process your grief." I would say, begin there. Process your grief, let it pour out of you onto the paper. And it doesn't much matter what you write. I gave myself a goal, and I just decided I was going to start with, okay, You're going to write how the worst day of your life felt, the day that, I insisted on being the captain going down with the ship. I stayed there. I was the last person to leave on the last night before we closed the door. And I walked through the desolation. I sat in it. I experienced it. And then I wrote about it. It was the first thing I wrote. And then I decided to go back and write every other story I could remember from the rest of my career, which was a bit crazy, but because I still wasn't ready to face the how how we went from so successful to failure in 12 months.
What
And it
happened
was
to
my
you?
fault it
What
was,
happened?
and more important, what was my role in it? So
Yeah.
it was only by going through the process of writing every day, and it doesn't
Yeah.
much matter what you write about, that the writing became an obsession and took over my life. But far more important than in my particular case, the writing skills that it helped me develop. Um, Way more important was that I was able to look down at the end of 6 months and see my grief was on the page. My anger was on the page. The people I blamed was on the page, and I was free of it. And only then could I go on.
Sigmund Freud, 100 years ago, did an exercise with his students where his I think better to call them disciples because he had his own code uh, around him. And those who were going through traumatic events, he had them write about their past, and he noticed that the depressive symptoms would be going away. And I myself have written a book called It's a Workbook, inspired by a guy who went to McGill also called Jordan Peterson. You probably heard many things
I
about
don't
him.
know.
It's called, I never heard of him. Yeah, me neither. And it's called the Autobiography Program. And I noticed that like trauma essentially is an unfinished story where your inner alarm system has encountered a threat that led to the collapse of your past story, your idea of who you are, your idea of what the world is, or your idea of other people. And the only way really that I found to help those people to move on is to either cognitively or better in an authoring manner, like look back, face the thing that they are afraid of, and complete the story and extract the wisdom from whatever monster
Mhm.
they encountered or who they were moving forward in a way. How, if you look back at it, why do you think you were able to leave this chapter behind? Because this is a, let's not make this small, particularly men who are very diligent is particularly hard to move on. They're men killing themselves if their company was bankrupt. They jump out of buildings. Think of the Wall Street crash. Like, what allowed you to move onwards? And also curious as a side note, what was your relationship with faith during these times? Because those were always moments where I met someone or something, so to say.
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One, my wife has always been my partner and my sounding board and the person who always holds up the mirror for me when I need it held up for me.
Oh,
So she was, through all this, she was my rock. And um, but she also knew that at a certain level, I had to work it out for myself. And I had no idea the journey that I was on while I was on it. In fact, it was only after I published Breakdown, which was basically the career story. I took all those stories that I'd written and turned it into a book, including, the fellow I talked about who got me into law school and became the producer and became my client. I actually sent him a few chapters at the beginning of the book, and he sent me back some script notes. Said, "This is an interesting story. Don't give it up." And then I called an agent friend of mine, a literary agent, and he said, well, actually, because of the grandeur of the fall, and then we had former prime ministers working for us as well, who I had the privilege of working with over the years. Um, and I'd met with world leaders, and my life had been charmed, and suddenly it wasn't anymore. But when I called up the agent and he said, I think this is a book that people will want to read. He said, but how long's the manuscript? And I said, 750 pages. And he said, Norm, nobody's that interested in your life. Call me back when it's 300. What it forced me to do, and this is where the hard work with my editor began, was to take a series of stories and turn it into a story with a line and Uncle Harry's River running through it all the way, so that you as a reader could see the development, the highs, the crash. But and I can say this honestly, it took me 5 years of lecturing about the story before I could really truly understand it.
If those who haven't read it, who are going to read your book, if they can only take one thing away from it, something they will never forget and carry with themselves, what would you as the author would like them to embody, so to say?
It's going to sound strange because there are all kinds of lessons, including, philosophies of leadership, uh, what I call and we touched on one of them, my three C's, which I'm not even sure I write about in the book, but which came out of it. And one, as we said, culture. Um, two, so establish a clear culture. To communicate to everyone in your organization. It doesn't matter what level, to make sure they understand the culture. And the third C is consistency, and that is your day-to-day actions have to be consistent with who you say you are. And the moment that they are no longer consistent, and this came through the analysis of, okay, why did we fail and how did it happen so fast? And that's, we had a change of leadership, and suddenly there's a change of direction. So the place that everybody signed up to be at, when you looked at what the day-to-day steps taken by leadership and management were no longer consistent. And that breeds skepticism and contempt. And that is at the root of the destruction of any organization. So, so my story, the breakdown, became a story of how do you build it? What are the elements of building it? And ultimately, how fragile is an organization or the bonds holding people together? And what causes them, like kind of like a nuclear reaction to break apart. So it starts off small, and then suddenly, you've destroyed the universe. But it's the
You've
bonds
destroyed
holding
the,
together are
the
still trust, consistency, and sending a message and making sure every single thing you do in your organization is consistent with the message.
I had a relationship once, Norman, and it fell apart during one of my earliest ventures, and I love that person very much. And I wrote a lot of relationship books afterwards, trying to figure out what I could have done to avoid this. That was like my little soul searching. And I talked to one person. His name is Robert Tybeby. He's a best-selling author from the relationship counseling sector, relationship counseling for 40 years, and he said something so obvious where it's like usually people break up when the core need that led those two people to each other is not being satisfied anymore, or in your words, if the rules of of the universe are no longer being honored. And looking back at it, for me, it was we started on a ethos of co-creation, but at some point it didn't work out, and I started to only focus on the money, and I didn't even notice anymore because somehow I had the narrative in my mind, it's like this needs to be profitable, and I didn't even notice that I was betraying the very core values of that little universe. And in retrospectively, I was quite fascinated how you can destroy an enterprise, whether it's a relationship or a big company, if you destroy the story, and how even a big tower like this with hundreds of people can collapse rather quickly in a way. Um, yeah, that's just some side ruminations from my side. What was your relationship with McGill, and how do you feel? Uh, what role has played standard education in your journey towards becoming who you are? That makes sense.
Uh, Perhaps I don't. It was. I spent 4 years there in the law school, and they were 4 great years of my life. Um, in terms of what they gave me to carry on my life, um, they helped shape the way I think. And beyond that, they left me completely unprepared for my career. In fairness, it was too academic, not practical
Very,
enough.
very eloquent and diplomatic way to answer this question. I can see that you've worked with some politicians along the way.
Started
And
with
if you,
some.
I'd say like it's obvious that you've worked with some politicians because there was a very diplomatic answer.
Well, nobody's
If
ever
you,
asked me that question. But at the end, they're still my alma mater, and I still wear the jacket. And there's a funny story behind the jacket. But every fall I put on my McGill jacket, and I wear it proudly outside, particularly in Toronto, where McGill is red, Toronto is blue, and I'm the one red jacket in a sea of blue, and I wear it proudly. So in fairness, there's an emotional tie that I have to my past that I ought to give the university credit for building.
I like the way you think. If you would record a TED talk called "How to Reason Like a Lawyer," what would be the first thing? What would be the first thing you would speak about?
Listen, stop talking and listen. You're going to be way more valuable to the world if you listen, you synthesize, and then you respond, as opposed to proving how smart you are.
What comes to your mind when you think of the word professional distance? Like one of the things that I have a hard time with, Norman, is I tend to meet everybody as a friend, and I sometimes forget that the most the best negotiators in the world, I feel they are professionals in their way. And I think like lawyers embody this form of professional excellence, but there's also somewhat of a distance between them and their clients. It almost reminds me of a military kind of environment where the captain respects the crew of the board, but there's some kind of distance with him that has a role with it.
Yeah,
How do you handle this, and how do you handle the distance?
I, 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 I think you have to accept as a leader that it can be lonely. That even when you're being friendly to everyone, you have a role to fulfill and a duty to your organization that exceeds all of your friendships. So it's always a balancing act, but there's a certain part of you that needs to be remote from everyone. I don't want to sound cynical now, but I have always believed philosophically that business life is a game, and the game goes to the person that plays it best, and the rules are always changing. And the person that will succeed is the one who can always figure out what the rules are and then plays it to the best of their ability, putting emotion aside, putting everything else aside. It's just about how do I play this situation to obtain the best result. And sometimes it is to show an empathy that maybe you're not actually feeling. Sometimes it will be to manage the most difficult personality you've ever met in your life in order to obtain the optimum result for both of you. So you have to do things, I think, as a leader that are sometimes counterintuitive, that are sometimes completely at odds with who you are, uh, in a view towards putting your organization first and its objectives. And some would say winning. I don't call it winning. I call it just playing the game better than anybody else. And I know when I say those words, it sounds cynical, but I found it always worked. Like sometimes I just had to put my personal views aside um, in order to obtain the best possible result for the organization or for my career.
Toughest choice you made as a leader?
Pardon me?
What was the hardest decision you had to make as a leader?
My first year in Toronto. All right. We were in office. We started with four. By the end of the year, we were eight. The woman who was running our photocopy machine wasn't able to keep up, and I had to fire her. And all I could remember thinking was, that part of me that was thinking, I'm destroying this person's life. Maybe more momentarily, but in that moment, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing it. I know what I have to do. And it completely tore me apart. But I did it. And that was 1990. So this is what, 35 years later? It's a story that won't ever leave me.
Advice for somebody who is in the same shoes where they have
Leadership
this.
is hard. Leadership is hard. You have to make tough decisions. Um, you have to, and this was something, and I try to be humble about it, but one of my talents, has always been managing people, knowing when I need to fight them, knowing when I need to give in to them, knowing, and the most important lesson I would say is knowing when to listen and how to listen. And the key thing I learned as a leader, and I learned it the hard way. One of my friends, I was managing partner. He was a lawyer in another office. We went through law school together. He comes into my office one day, and he comes in and he sits down. And I've been managing partner of the firm for less than a year, like maybe 6 months. And he comes in and he complains about another partner he's having a problem with in Montreal, and it's a very powerful person in the office. And he sits down, and for half an hour he tells me his woes, and I'm sitting there thinking, I'm going to be a failure at this job. I have no words of comfort for him. I have no words of advice for him. His situation is awful, and I have no clue even where to begin fixing it. So maybe I should resign tomorrow. So I walk around, carrying my sorry rear end around, feeling sorry for myself and saying, what did I get myself into? I can't do this job. And about 2 weeks later, he calls me. He's back in Montreal and I'm in Toronto. And he says, Norm, I'm just calling to thank you. And I take the receiver and I'm staring at it like I'm on a different planet. Okay, for what? He said, when I came into your office 2 weeks ago, I know there was nothing you could do to solve my problem. I know the only person that could solve my problem was me by dealing with it. He said, but you were there and you listened to me. And that made all the difference and gave me the strength to figure out what I had to do. And I hung up the phone and I said, oh, maybe I can do this job.
Freud once said that no one is a man or woman, I'm sure he meant also, unless their father has died. And I believe it was more meant in a metaphorical sense, where the idea that someone is going to come to save you is perishing. And you realize it's you, and people are busy, and you need to figure out your own stuff. And something beautiful about the therapeutic profession is that you always have these moments where they are looking at you and they're realizing this guy ain't leaving this office and is fixing this for me. It's like it's me, or it's going to get worse.
And it's,
Um,
it's the base of my consulting. It's the base of my consulting practice now. I will sit down. I will listen to a leader, and sometimes it's in person, sometimes it's by Zoom, sometimes it's over the phone. And one of the places I was consulting called me the doctor, uh, and they'd call me in and I'd say, okay, let's talk about what this week's problem is, and they'd outline it and go through it. And by the time they were finished, and I'd ask a few questions, my answer was always the same. You already know what you have to do. You're just afraid to do it. You don't need me to tell you, you know.
it's very interesting actually when you talk to people, and the part of themselves that is speaking to you is like, are they waiting for somebody to save them, or are they actually trying to solve things forward for them? Very, very interesting. Any advice on how to silence the the voice within yourself that you're helpless, or the voice that comes up in tough decisions where you'll feel this is above you? I feel like, for instance, in my situation, I'm for the first time like encountering challenges like, such as like fundraising, all these kind of things. These are foreign to me, and sometimes I grew up in special circumstances, but my mother, for instance, didn't have a lot of money sometimes in her life, and I feel like sometimes when you listen enough to a certain radio tune, it becomes part of your own psyche and it gets played in those kind of circumstances in a way. How did you manage to take charge of the remote control of your psyche, and what advice would you give to a leader who battles hopelessness or self-doubt or low
Well,
self-efficiency in those moments? No?
yeah, well, I mean, there's two answers here. That the harder part is how do you manage your success when you realize it's just me. I'm not nearly as good as anybody thinks I am. And they have, the name for it now is imposter syndrome. But when I started feeling it, it hadn't been invented yet, and I had nowhere to turn. I didn't understand it myself, and I walked around feeling, I don't know, for over a year like a fraud. Like I'd hit the success way ahead of my time. As I said, I went from obscurity to sudden, relative fame in an industry. And that's when the voice in my head was, "You're not this good. You're a fraud." And tomorrow is the day everybody's going to figure it out. And it was interesting because after about a year of it, it just kind of dissipated, and I stopped hearing the voice. I toughed through it, and I'm not sure that's the best way. Now you can talk about it. It's got a name, it's got a label. You can acknowledge it, and people who've been through it, which is probably most successful people, will tell you it's a phase. You just accept it. But in terms of the rest, and it's hard. It's one of the things you accept when you are the leader is there are going to be hard nights when you scratch your head and you wonder if you did the right thing, and you just hope you did. And sometimes those days turn into weeks, months, and even years. Uh, but you just it's the hard part of being a leader is you're going to have that period of potential self-doubt, and the feeling that you're in the wilderness. And to me, the best answer to that is you need to surround yourself with positive people who 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 believe what you're doing is right. And sometimes you just need to feed off their positive energy when you're doubting yourself, because it's inevitable. It's going to happen. The worst thing you can do, though, is surround yourself with doubters.
It's very interesting also for me. Like, I was very blessed that I had like one Morphean mentor. Like, even though my father was far away, but he had this strange, almost like an there was nothing I could do that would convince this person that I would not be contribute something mighty to the world. And he really believed it, but it was like no matter how much I was fucking up, and I was messing up very badly. Yeah. So it's like, I could understand my teacher who said like this guy is going to go to prison or die or whatever. But I think like if you have one person who believes in you, it's quite interesting that that seems to be the right amount of number you need to do the unbelievable, so to say, which I
Listen,
find
it's
interesting.
much easier to go through life with balanced parents who believe in you, and I feel bad, for the Donald Trumps of the world, who didn't have that.
I think like from I would love to have your take on that, because for what I found, and the most successful people, or success is relative, right? Let's say like for the people who are accomplished in their particular domain the most, it usually feels to me that they had a Morphean part. Like for instance, Alexander the Great, he had the mother who told him you're the descendant of Zeus and you're
Yeah.
born to conquer the world. But on the other side,
That
there,
was my mother, by the
for me,
way.
that was my father, and it calls you like you are like flirting with narcissism. personality disorder for phases. But what I also found that there was this Trumpian parent who does not believe in you, who cripples you. And it's like one story always comes to mind. It's like Mike Tyson and his mentor Costamaro, where
Mhm.
one day he was telling him you're the best fighter in the world, that you could even beat the gods. And then a moment later he would make him very small. It's like clean this floor, you nothing. And he was like, it seems to be the combination of extra like this megalomaniac ego and this something broken where you feel you always have to do more and can never stop. What in regards to your own psyche, what's something you feel that ain't clicking just right that gave you a competitive advantage, or do you feel you have been spared of this?
Yeah, I would fortunately say I was spared.
Mm.
You know, I had a mother who thought I was, basically the second coming of Jesus, and a father who donated his genes to me that left me, relatively speaking, unflappable. So that's just the luck of genetics.
Yeah.
So I don't, I'm genetically not programmed to get overly upset when something bad happens.
Oh, so you feel like you have a genetic disposition where you're more stoic by your temperament and you don't have
So
interesting.
I don't have the emotional reaction that other people have, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's not that I won't feel
Interesting.
bad, but I don't understand panic. Oh, sorry, I only once understood panic when I was in a situation where it was actually after the Toronto Blue Jays won the World Series in 1993. We were caught in a crush of fans, yeah, at an intersection in downtown Toronto. And suddenly I was with my wife. We completely lost control of our bodies.
Oh, wow.
And as the crush of the crowd took over, and that was the only time in my entire life that I can recall panicking.
Interesting. Very interesting. Um, speaking of leadership, I think like one thing I'm interested in also is how people transition out of adolescence into becoming an adult. And what do you feel like one of the activating factor I also found was encounters with malevolence or adversity. But it seems to be like encountering something close to evil or something, or like an enemy or a threat, can also change your idea, and your bubble gets popped in regards to the you still being in Wonderland, so to say. Any story that comes to your mind where
Yeah,
you
I've never had to, fortunately experience that kind of trauma. It was much lower level, almost embarrassingly much lower level. I played on a football team where we were two Jews on the entire team, and we had an anti-Semitic quarterback, and we didn't realize that till the end of the season. And we were the okay Jews, we were the exception because we were good people, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and would, as an adult, would have dealt with it differently than the way I did as a 16-year-old, which was actually 15, which was just kind of to ignore it. I don't think the adult would have ignored it. But and it was
which
a lesson that I really only understood years later. The interesting thing is with the team we were playing against. It was a provincial championship, and this only came up because they came from a largely Jewish district. Our team was completely mixed. We had people from socioeconomic economically completely disadvantaged to middle class, and not much else. And the other team came from a sort of what you would say is the affluent Jewish neighborhood, but not in reality, just in perception, because their head coach wasn't even Jewish. But the joke in the locker room for the week, as we were preparing, like every possible Jewish joke, every single trope came out, and we just sat there. The two Jews, we sat there with our heads down, and part of me, when we lost the game 52-6, like we were completely thrashed. There was the teammate part of me who was completely crushed, and the Jewish part of me that was completely thrilled. But I only really I couldn't verbalize it at the time. I couldn't really understand it. My way of dealing with it at the time was keep your head down and just ignore it. He's ignorant. Uh, I don't think I would do that as an adult.
Many of my friends who are founders or also just humans had their biggest fights. It involved a lawsuit for there seems to be something like a word I use is lawfare, like the idea of something you need to be well versed in when you're a leader, a founder, or just a human being. If you would write a manual on how to on war through law, like what would you involve in this in a way? Because I feel most people are not even thinking about these things all day until they are
Until it
encountering.
happened. And I went through it. I went through it personally. While I was the leader, it was a huge, one of my clients was taken over. And they did it because they thought they would scoop all the business that I had helped them develop. So I think what most people in my situations, particularly as lawyers, would do would say, oh, well, there's nothing I can do about it. And my reaction, um, and it didn't surprise me because I never even gave it a moment's thought, was no, I'm about to enter into a war. And now is the real test of my strategic abilities. And I fought that war, and it was serious at all. They threatened a lawsuit against my firm. They threatened a lawsuit against me personally. It came to the 11th hour, and I called the bluff. I told my lawyers, we're calling. I think it's a bluff. They're not going to sue us. I could have been wrong. I wasn't. We ended up settling. Uh, but it was a bitter, bitter, bitter fight. Well fought from beginning to end. It lasted almost 8 months. Uh, and when we finally settled, uh, because inevitably it had to, the adversary on the other side said, "Norm, you gave me hives," and that was the nicest thing anybody had ever said to me. But, and here's the but, a number of years later, his father died. And he was one of those people with, his reputation was very rough and tumble, take no prisoners, fight. It's all about me. That's the kind of, business. And of course, that type of personality never sees that in themselves. Um, but when his father died, I went to the Shiva, to the mourning,
Oh, really?
because the inner voice in me said, um, this will create a lasting peace forevermore. And it turned out to be right. Like it was the one human connection at his lowest point, because he had an incredible connection with his late father. But it was the only thing I could have ever done, which took me in estimation from somebody he was trying to crush to someone who he completely respected.
This story my father often told me, Norman, was the French invaded Lebanon about 100 years ago, and there was this mountain. So at least the story says, these old stories are always a little bit pimped up. And they said that the French and my people, they fought there valiantly. And while they're being butchered, during the midtime, my family or my descendant would always come down and bring them food. And while being in war with them, and then would leave, and the next day go back to butchering each other. And I always was fascinated by the human character of like that there seems to be even gentlemen in a war, and that just because you're disagreeing over something doesn't mean we have to neglect with the whole humanity. And also the idea that enemies of today are that you shouldn't like cut out the idea that they may be friends of tomorrow or something, or that we have to coexist with them. You were also an expert at negotiation. If you would brief me or me as a representing for the founding cohort of people who are starting something, how do you negotiate, and what are the some core principles that have served you well in this setting?
The starting principle is always the same. Who has the leverage? You can't negotiate the same deal when you don't have the leverage that you can when you do. That's point number one. Point number two is forget about what you want. What do you need? And don't worry so much about what they want. Your goal as a negotiator is to figure out what they need. And if you can do that, you're not always going to get what you want. That's the point. But you are always going to get what you need. And Rolling Stone said it perfectly.
No, it's beautiful. And I just had a little aha moment for myself where through my counseling experience, you often think about what the other person wants, and I realized that I'm making a strong emphasis in negotiation right now to be liked and be nice rather than maybe be a firmer representative of the venture that I'm
Yeah,
leading.
you don't need to be nice. You just need to get into their heads. I mean, that's the key in the negotiation. You just have to get into their heads and figure out what it is they need. And don't give them more than that.
Maybe it's just me, but I have been in a couple of moments where my business nearly died. Days away from running out of not being able to make payroll, lawsuit, whatever. I'm sure you have had your sense. When you think of your darkest hour as a leader, what moments comes to mind in a Churchillian sense, and who were you in this particular moment, and what kind of spirit would you like the next person in line to embody to not
I
perish in
think
that moment?
I think a few things. The first thing you always need to remember is as dark as it is, or as stressful as it is, and particularly the stressful, that's all self-imposed. And sometimes you you need to be able to step back and say, uh, "I've lost. It's over," and move on, and don't dwell on it. Because the only thing you can control, and that's why it comes down to leverage. Sometimes, if you don't have the leverage and you know you're going to lose, you have a choice. You can let it destroy the rest of your life, or you can say that this chapter is over. It's time to start a new chapter. And I'm going to consciously cut off that loss and focus what's always worked for me before on the positive side to whatever it is I'm going to do next. And I say it as if it's easy. It isn't. It's very hard. But the only thing you control is your mindset.
Psychologically speaking, when you feel anxiety, it's usually because the incongruence between the desired outcome and the actual reality is too far apart. But there
Mhm.
seems to be always people who are, Nietzsche said it, like you can measure the quality of a man by how much truth they can tolerate. And
And I have to say, in those moments, and they happen periodically, where I feel great anxiety about a situation and I wake up in the middle of the night, and it's usually because I can't control the outcome.
yeah,
Uh, I remind myself 6 months from now, I'll be sleeping again. And this person or thing that's causing all my pain and my grief, I won't ever think about again. That I find that helps it pass faster. But when you're in the middle of it, of course you feel the anxiety. As long as you feel you can exert some kind of control over the outcome, you will feel anxiety. And all you can do is remind yourself, I can only control what I control. and the rest is up to fate, and we're just going to go with it. But it's easier to say when you're the bystander than when you're in it. And I can tell you, when I'm in it, I feel the anxiety, and it builds. And from time to time, what I have remembered is this horrible phase is going to end, and I'll be sleeping again, and I will have perspective on what this was. And at that point in time, I will say to myself, I can't figure out why I let it bother me so much. But again, much easier to say in hindsight than to live through.
Question that has served me well also is like, am I overestimating the threat and underestimating myself in those moments? And I was blessed to also come across people like you who strangely calm in situations where they are encountering a formidable force. And I have even met some leaders who start smiling in those situations where they have been miserable pricks when they are in an
Oh,
environment. There's some people who just like to fight also, and it's like knowing that
it's a negotiating tactic I figured out years ago.
really.
Yeah, that when you have the irrational bastard on the other side, the only pain you can inflict on him is smiling.
The
Because
irrational bastard on the other.
now and it's inevitably it's a man. I don't think I've ever had this with a woman because I know they're looking at me, and some have come up to me afterwards and said, "You son of a bitch. I wanted you to react. You didn't give me the pleasure. It drove me insane." Like that smile drove me insane. And worst of all, I had no bloody idea what you were thinking.
Mm.
So as a negotiating technique, it almost always worked. Like don't react to it, just smile. And the other thing you can do is nod knowingly. Like you're doing exactly the opposite of what they want you to do, and it drives them nuts.
Do you have a favorite question in regards to a negotiation setting? I feel like questions for me are much about listening, but also asking the right questions. How do you get what you want out of it? Any particular prompt?
I usually come in knowing what I need. Like, there's no point going into negotiation if you don't know what you need. So I spend all my, and as a lawyer, because remember, as a lawyer doing this, you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your client. I would go to the client and I said, this is my strategy. In one case, I said, listen, I'm going to do things in this meeting. They're going to be bizarre. Okay. I just need you to play along. I can't tell you what it is. I just need you to play along with me. Just trust me, it's going to work. And why? Because I had done the complete psychological assessment of my opponent. I knew them inside out. And I came up with a strategy to get what I wanted and to give them what they needed. So, and there's no one size fits all, but I find it much easier, as the client's advisor, I'd say, okay, we're going into this meeting. This is what we need to achieve. This is how I'm going to do it. Just watch. It's going to be unorthodox, but just watch. I'm fairly confident that this is going to work. And
How do you?
very often it was about um, taking our weakest negotiating point and camouflaging it. So
How do you?
redirecting them to something else so that it was interesting. There was no, I'm not even going to go into this now. I'll leave it for another time.
Please, no, please. This is the good stuff. I feel like these are the
Oh no,
secret rules you can't get at law school.
the one thing I learned about negotiation, and it turned out to be like an unbelievable lesson. Like, because I didn't study it. Like, this is something law school might have taught me if they were being useful. But in negotiations, there are anchored negotiations and unanchored negotiations, which I suppose if you're teaching it, the theory sounds pretty easy. So in anchored negotiations, pretty well, like in a union negotiation, it's, the employer is offering a salary of X and the union's coming in and saying, no, we need Y. And then they will spend anywhere from an hour to 2 months getting to somewhere between X and Y. and because those are anchors. So ultimately, somebody's going to have to give in, or both parties will give in. And then there are unanchored negotiations where you have no idea what the right number is, like not the slightest conception. It could be $2, it could be $2 million. You just don't, you have no idea in the world because there's no precedent for what the right number is. And what I learned in the negotiation course is in an unanchored negotiation, the first one to speak wins. You never go in to an unanchored asking the other side what they want. Because if I want $1 million and you only want to pay me two, if I let you say $2, this is all I'm prepared to pay you, then my $1 million is going to sound ridiculous. And my brain is going to say, well, if he's only at two, I can't ask for more than 100,000. Maybe we'll settle for 50. But if I speak first and say, listen, your right amount here is $1 million. Now, what kind of an idiot do you look like offering to? You're better off just getting up and walking out. But you've allowed me to anchor. And I learned that it was a director's education course. And wouldn't you know, and which was it was, I think it cost $30,000 that my firm paid. And wouldn't you know, 12 months later, I had set up a situation where I was in one of those situations. And the right number was somewhere between zero and $5 million. And I made sure I spoke first.
How do you command respect when you're speaking?
You can't command respect. All you can do is be authentic, or at least appear to be authentic.
Appear to be authentic. Um,
And you have to be passionate. You have to be passionate about whatever it is you're talking about. If you're not, apart from anything else, you're putting everybody to sleep.
if I would have looked at how you prepare for one of your negotiations, any kind of rituals that come to mind that help you to get into the flow, or you just wake up in your usual mindset and take this to the kind of to the room?
You have to do your homework. You have to know. You have to spend your time getting to understand the other side in the negotiation, and really try to get into their heads. That's part one, and but more important, part two, you need to understand what your leverage is and what their leverage is. And if I have something I know you really want, that's my leverage. What am I going to get for it? It's all a question of, okay, so what am I going to get for that? Because I know of the 10 things on your list, I know there's only one you really care about. And that's what I'll give you, but only when I get and your job is to make sure that I don't overreach when I'm getting it back. But that's, yeah, I spend all my time trying to try and understand what that is.
You spend also time working with prime ministers and world leaders. I'm not sure if any of this is can be discussed openly, but what was this chapter about, and what did you learn from
Um, well, in the case of Pierre Trudeau, uh, I learned about how much wisdom comes from worldliness and how much perspective you can have on a problem simply because of your life experience that no one else shares. Like as a world leader, if you've inserted yourself into all kinds of situations, uh, an experience and a knowledge that transcends anything I've experienced. So foolish of me not to come to you to say, here's my problem. How would you approach it? And listen to him come back with an answer in a million years I never would have come up with. And in the other, that was him. In the case of Jean Chrétien, it was a man who always appeared to be the common man with the common touch, and was 100 times smarter than he ever let on. Really good native sense. And he also knew exactly how to push the right buttons in a negotiation. That was his brilliance.
You take transform your experience or encounter with them into a life or leadership lesson
Well,
that
we
you
turned him into
can.
an extraordinarily valuable asset because that was an asset clients wanted. Like, how do you solve how can you help us solve an insoluble problem? That was probably still is his expertise. I think he's 90 now, but that hasn't left him. He knows how to solve a problem, and that can be a very valuable asset for a law firm.
What is the standard operating procedure for you on how to solve the problem? Because in the end, that's I think what leaders actually are paid to do, so to say, right? It's like solve the problem
Yeah,
somebody else
yeah.
can do.
You have to listen. You have to listen really carefully and try and shut your mouth. Try not to speak. Listen. Don't jump to conclusions. Listen, especially when you're solving something within your or own organization. Never respond to a complaint. Always sit down and get the full story before, somebody will come into, to my office and say, I can't believe what so and so did to me, or so and so said, or how they've interfered with my client. And your gut reaction is, okay, I'm just going to go confront the other person and deal with it. And that's exactly the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do would say, and A just told me a story, never mind what he told me. I just want to hear your side of the story. But no, no, no buts. Just tell me what happened. And what you find out is you've got two different stories half the time. Now that said, I still remember there was one situation. I had two partners at war with each other, at absolute war, and it was a small local office that I was a few thousand miles away from, and it was destroying. Like everyone in the office was complaining, Norm, come out and deal with this. Like, what am I going to do? I'm not God. So I listened to both sides, and they talked about their grievances with one another. Uh, Went home, thought about it, and then I called them both up individually and independently, and I said, "Here are your options. You can go and apologize and solve this, or it's costing you 50. I'm penalizing you $50,000. Did I have the right to do that? Absolutely not. Did I have the authority? Absolutely not. And I picked a number in the context big enough for the shock factor. And all I said was, listen, you're destroying the office with this. And you either go and apologize or I'm docking you $50,000. And I told both guys the same thing. And the next day they walked in to one another's office. They didn't exactly apologize, but the war was over. And neither of them could remember why it started. That's one of my favorite stories.
I love this also. Um, which leaders in the world inspire you today?
Um, it's hard. It's hard because they're so human. They don't always do what I want them to do. and it's and today it's particularly hard um, uh, because of the central force of world politics right now, that nobody can behave normally around. So in some respects, no, I respect those who have figured out how to manipulate him for their ability to do that, to get what they want or what they need, more important, what they need. Um, but in a lot of respects, I don't think anybody's behaving normally anymore. So like the whole baseline has changed.
For leadership, do you think it has gotten more
So
extreme?
again, from a world leader perspective.
Yes, yes. Do you think like one of the things that I was worrying about was I had a strange and very unspectacular story, but I was posting some content of myself on some social media platforms, and I had one story that was a bit on the edge. That story did 50 times better than the stories where I would speak calmly, and I was just like, I had like hundreds of thousands of views and comments, and it was very, very interesting because I know from a psychological perspective that attention is a reinforcing factor, and I was like, huh, who would I become as a person if I would follow the dictates of these platforms that are being created? And then I thought like at some point, like every world leader is a content creator, and they are being shaped by the applause that they are getting. And that's like when I got very worried because I knew, for instance, in Germany, um, I'm in
Only, only,
grown.
only those with very low self-esteem.
Oh, very interesting. Who's been
The
interesting?
ones, now I look at our Canadian Prime Minister, uh,
What's your
his
take on Justin Trudeau?
Justin Trudeau. It's hard to me to be fair because I knew his father personally. I've actually never met him, so I look at him more. Um, I was sitting at his father's funeral. I was fortunate enough to be on the invitation list. Basically it was a state funeral, and a few of us from the firm were invited to attend. It was interesting because Fidel Castro was there as well. He was sitting in I think, a bulletproof glass booth at the back, and so that's my as close as I ever got to Fidel. Um, but I can remember that Justin getting up to do the final eulogy, which was broadcast all over the country. And about 2 minutes into the speech, I said to myself, this is not a eulogy. This is a man who wants to be prime minister one day. This is his coming out party. And I think I pretty well nailed that. Um, so he was obviously driven, in some respects, driven by ambition. Has had the charisma that his father had, in a different way, but had the charisma, and certainly enough charisma that the party machinery could could get behind him as someone who could win an election. Uh, did I like his politics? No. Did I like his approach? No. Um, he was, in some respects, too nice, and extraordinarily symbolic of the times, where DEI reigned supreme. So would I have done some of the things he did? No. On the other hand, would I have ever wanted to be prime minister? Not in a million years. In a lot of respects, I think that the process of becoming the leader of a country requires you to become somebody or not. And the only exception to that, I'd say, is Jean Chrétien, uh, who had the common man touch and came by it honestly. But I still remember a story he told. I brought him to Toronto a few times, and he loved glad handing. And it didn't matter where you were in the pecking order. And he came in, and we had staff in the boardroom, students, lawyers, partners, and anybody who wanted to attend from the support staff. And he'd come and he'd make a speech, and he'd be very charming. And he'd finish the speech with him remembering just being a child, and he was the youngest of 13 kids. And his father took him. The current Prime Minister of Canada at that time, I think it was Louis Saint Laurent, had come to Shawinigan and come to town to meet, whoever the leaders were. But he walked down the street, down the main street, and his father brought him to see the prime minister and pushed him out in front of him and almost out onto the street. And he said, I want you to go shake his hand. And little Jean turns to his father and he says, "Why? He'll never remember me." And his father says, "Because when you have the chance to shake the hand of a prime minister, you take it." And he finished the story, and then he just flash around the room and smile and wait for people to line up and shake hands with him. And that was his humor.
You've been also a board member, and my name, Daniel, is inspired by the protagonist of the Book of Daniel, who was also an advisor to the king Nebuchadnezzar. So I have special interest in learning how to be a good advisor myself one day to hopefully
Stay
very
away from the
know.
whales.
Yeah, but what is your if you were write a like a document for board of advisory members or board members on how to give good advice, what would you write in it? And also maybe also for the role of it, because it seems that there's founders are afraid these days of their board, I noticed. And
The
and
best board members understand the business. And then each board member brings their background and experience, which hopefully will be varied. But I can tell you, for my first year on the Lionsgate board, I was in awe of the experience and expertise of the people surrounding me. And for the most part, I kept my mouth shut for the first year. Like I had been their legal counsel before I joined the board, so I knew as much as I could about certain aspects of the company. Um, that was respected. But when it came to corporate finance and impact on market and share price and things we needed to do, I just sat and listened and was in awe of the people sitting around the table. So part of it is, gathering in the experience from the other people you have the privilege to sit on the board with, if you're sitting on a good board, obviously. The other thing, I became a far more effective board member when I began to attend audit committee meetings. Even though because of my position as counsel of the company, I wasn't allowed to formally sit on the audit committee. But my ability to advise the company changed dramatically when I sat in the room listening to all the questions that picked the company. We had a very good audit, very solid audit committee, and they would pick the company apart. And I suddenly understood it in a nuts and bolts kind of way that I never could have gotten just by listening to management. So from my perspective, from a public company perspective, like understanding the numbers and how you get to the numbers and what the breakdowns are and what the key business relationships are and who they are, and then sometimes how you can help is critical. But if you're just going to sit in the meetings and thinking your worldly experience is going to be helpful to the company, you're completely deluding yourself. You need to understand the nuts and bolts of the company almost as well as management if you're going to be a good director, because then your outside experience starts to become very valuable. You can now show them a way of looking at something that they perhaps can't see themselves, and the key moment for me is we were on the edge of having a takeover battle with an activist investor, and the boardroom issue was, do we capitulate or do we fight? And I was, one of only two directors who said, I think we should fight. I'm a pacifist by nature, but if you push me, I'm going to be your adversary. And I learned that from the fight that I had, from the legal battle that I outlined earlier. And now, if you push too far, I will push back. And I was a strong believer that that the company should push back. And the board went in a different direction. Uh, but one of the members of the board came up to me afterwards and said, "I will never forget that you did this." So that was my proud moment. But from my perspective, you also bring your personality to the board. So I was always sort of let's not get too upset about what appears to be very upsetting. Let's take a look and try and understand this in the general context, and stay rational about our approach in terms of what we do next.
Two questions for your board. Who who do you ask? How many? And how do you ask people to join your board? So three questions.
Uh, the second question is not too many. The bigger your board, the more paralytic it becomes. On the other hand, your biggest challenge um, as a leader is groupthink. Your biggest problem is groupthink. That board members who just go along with management because it sounds good. So you need board members who will probe you, who will challenge you, and who will make your ideas better. Like if you just have yes men or women, you're not getting what you need. You need people who will push back and make you refine your ideas to make them better.
Should they have interest for?
That's the key thing I'd look for. That, and that's the first thing. The second thing you want um, uh, are talents that can advance talents and or connections that can advance your business. That's also pretty critical. It's very nice to be able to go to a board member and say, "Can you make this call for me to this person that you know because this is what I need."
How do
So
you
there,
ask? How do you ask somebody to join? And could you say, like, clarify on the number, just your gut feeling of like, what is the ideal number for your council?
it depends on, part of it depends on, the size of the organization, the types of decisions you need to be making, the growth curve you're on. I'd say probably five would be a good number. It's got to be an odd number. Um, and five may be enough. But the other issue is who from the insiders need to sit on your board. So the bigger question is how many outsiders, independent outsiders, do you want on your board? And maybe the good number is three to start. And then, sorry, I have to cut off in about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, let's.
It's
Can
only
we?
been two and a half hours.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was losing the time anyway. Do we have time for the rapid fire question, and then we
Sure,
shut
go
it
ahead.
off?
Yeah.
Okay. Alexandrian questionnaire. Then I'm gonna shut up. Favorite question of yours?
Favorite question of mine. Uh, what do you want to do today? What do you
Your
want to
f-
accomplish? What do you want to
your fa
accomplish?
your favorite word?
Gee, I never thought about that. Yes.
Least favorite word?
It isn't no.
A quote that you'd
Actually, the
strive.
least favorite would be I can't.
I can't. A book that changed your life.
Um, I'm thinking of a few of them. Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides. Sat on my night table for 5 years and humbled me in terms of my lack of knowledge of anything.
A quote you strive to live by.
Be yourself.
Two questions, then we're done. If you could resurrect three people from history to add your personal board of advisors, who would you pick? What would be the first question you ask?
Mm, gee whiz, never thought of that. I'll probably have a probably as soon as we go, I'll probably spend the night thinking about that. I should call you back because like I'm a complete blank right now. But and part of it is I've had when you've had the advantage of being able to go to a world leader and ask them questions, it's no, it's a hard one. It's a hard one.
Can skip.
Something will probably come to me, but
No problem. When we launch the marketplace, you can also do it for yourself. Okay,
Mhm.
last segment, then we're gonna shut up. I often spend time on graveyards. It inspired me by my project, and they have these one-liners above their grave. I think it's called epitaph or something. What would be like a motto or a mantra or something that you feel would be representative, that would come first to mind of what you would like to add there? And then afterwards, I have the last question for you.
He was a caring person.
We would equip this grave of yours with an avatar that could speak. If somebody would find this grave of yours by a pilgrimage, for instance, like a time capsule, what would you choose this avatar would say?
You can achieve so much if you believe in yourself.
For those who listen to this very interview, how can we support you and where can we find you?
You could find the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn, Norman Bacal, pretty simple. I also have a website, normanbacal.com. All my books are on Amazon, or you can find them through my website. The hardest part of finding me is just spelling my last name right, Bacal.
I will do this right in the title of this video. Thanks so much for joining today and for being so generous with your time and wisdom. I will leave you off right now. And for everybody who listened, thanks for making room for these long form conversations. I hope you learned as much as I do. Looking forward to speak to you in the next episode. Thanks so much.
My honor. Thank you.